Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Michael Purdy, Columbia's Executive Vice President for Research, and on behalf of President Bollinger, I welcome you to this afternoon's event, which is a truly university-wide forum that includes Columbia faculty members affiliated not only with the Earth Institute and Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, but also the Mailman School of Public Health, the School of International and Public Affairs, the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and our affiliated NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies. We're going to talk this afternoon about the reality that natural events control our environment, and that even when our predictive powers rise to the excellent level that they were in foreseeing the power of the superstorm Sandy, even then, still humankind, for reasons we will explore and discuss, suffer profound negative impacts. The depth and breadth of expertise that exists here at Columbia in climate change and the impacts of rising sea levels, both here in New York and around the world, is second to none. And we are eager students of everything that Sandy can teach us, and Sandy can teach us a lot. We cannot hope to cover all the aspects of this event in a single forum, so we expect that today's deliberations will be followed by others in the weeks and months ahead that will entrain our colleagues from the law school, from business school, from architecture, and from journalism. Our discussions this afternoon will, I hope, further fulfill what Columbia's President Bollinger believes are two important missions of a great university: to partner with the journalism profession to provide new insight into the problems and issues of the day, and to partner with policymakers providing expertise to governments to help our city, our region, and our world. To help us achieve this, we have assembled a superb group of panelists. Their biographies are up on the website, so I shall be brief in introducing them to you here in the Low Library, as well as to those of you watching online. First, Cynthia Rosenzweig. Cynthia is a senior research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and head of the Climate Impacts Group at our Earth Institute Center for Climate Systems Research. She co-chairs the New York City panel on climate change, and as so many of you know, like our colleague Klaus Jacob, Cynthia has been a key source of foresight and expertise in helping our city and region recognize and respond to the long-term challenge of the rising seas. Professor Erwin Redlener. Erwin is the clinical professor of population and family health and pediatrics and director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at our Mailman School of Public Health. He has been named by the governor as co-chair of the New York State READY Commission, which is responsible for finding ways to ensure critical systems and services are prepared for future natural disasters and other emergencies. Adam Sobel is a professor in Columbia's Departments of Earth and Environmental Sciences and Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics, and a researcher in the Division of Ocean and Climate Physics at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Adam is highly respected and widely cited for his great expertise on the interaction of climate and extreme weather. George Diodatis. On the end here is the Santiago and Robertina Calatrava Family Professor of Civil Engineering in the Department of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics at Columbia's Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. His field is probabilistic methods in civil engineering, and he is an expert modeling the impact of uncertain forces from earthquakes, wind, and wave loads on the structures we build. Ben Orlov is the senior research scientist at the Earth Institute's International Research Institute for Climate and Society and professor of international and public affairs. Ben is an anthropologist who has studied the impact of climate change and glacier retreat and draws important connections between these environmental changes, human behavior, and public policy. I'd like to express a special word of thanks to our moderator today, William Glasgow, on the far right for you. He's managing editor for states and municipalities at the Bloomberg News in New York, where he helped direct coverage of Sandy's impact on our region. A one-time fellow here at Columbia, Bill is the co-host of Bloomberg's Global Week Ahead podcast and a 20-year veteran of Business Week magazine. And let me just point out that when we in the scientific community, especially at an institution where our colleague Wally Broker invented the term global warming, see a respected mainstream media publication reporting like this post-Sandy cover story of Bloomberg Business Week, "It's global warming, stupid," we are very encouraged indeed. So we welcome Bloomberg News as a partner today, along with WNYC New York Public Radio, both of which are also streaming this online. A little later, we'll have some questions from listeners that were generated by a segment about this forum on the Brian Lehrer Show late last week. We thank them for their partnership in this important conversation. Finally, let's acknowledge that for those in our city and region who lost homes and businesses, and especially loved ones, there remains a long recovery ahead. Our thoughts are with them. We've put information in your programs and online about ways to support Sandy relief efforts, and it's so important that our generosity continue. Before we turn it over to our panel, we'll have a few words of welcome from someone who really needs no introduction, my good Columbia colleague and co-sponsor of today's forum, Earth Institute Director Jeff Sachs. No one better personifies the university's commitment to translating the best academic research into public policies that make a difference in our society. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Mike, thank you so much. Thanks to the university and President Bollinger and yourself for making this possible. We all have really a great, wonderful, and unique opportunity now to listen to this incredible array of experts. And we need such an array of expertise to make sense of a devastating shock like Hurricane Sandy and what it has meant. And so to have civil engineers, anthropologists, climatologists, urban sustainability specialists, disaster preparedness and response specialists is an unbelievable privilege for all of us. I know as director of the Earth Institute, it's an unbelievable feeling to know that when a storm is approaching, you could call Adam Sobel, as I did, say, "Adam, what's going on?" And he described in scintillating detail and accuracy what was underway, what was happening. To be able to call Cynthia and say, "What's this going to mean for the city," given that she led the studies, to know that colleagues like George Klaus Jacob, who's not here, have been talking about the vulnerability of the infrastructure of the city for so long. To know that Ben Orlov, right from the beginning of this storm, said we have to understand how people understand an event like this and to prepare for that and enable us to be able to react. And to have Erwin Redlener as a colleague who has probably responded to the public health emergencies that follow events like this more than perhaps anybody in the United States, other than and perhaps including FEMA itself, is really a remarkable opportunity. And Erwin is always there, not only in the front line, but always there explaining to us what we ought to be doing and how vulnerable the kids are, and how we have to step up our responses. This event has really hurt, and it unfortunately exemplifies the way that our country and the world is drifting right now. We're constantly underestimating the magnitude of the shocks. We are constantly underestimating the magnitude of the shifting distribution of extreme events, something that our colleague Jim Hansen told us about this summer when he showed statistically that heat waves that used to be 1 or 2 in 1,000 are now 50 or 100 per thousand in occurrences around the world. But we're also constantly overemphasizing our ability to protect ourselves and to anticipate and to respond resiliently to these shocks. This one shut down the center of the world economy for a long time, and it's quite shocking and saddening, but shocking also that parts of this area still don't have power turned back on and haven't had even the most basic services turned back on. It's not entirely amazing because we keep finding this time after time that we're just not so clever or prepared or understanding as we think we are. It was also stunning, and I'll close here with the fact that climate change and the environment almost didn't get one word of attention during a presidential campaign. And when energy was discussed at the presidential debate, in the second debate, at some length, neither candidate said a word about climate, didn't even mention it. Then it turned out that climate and climate change were thrust to the very forefront by reality, not by the political advisors, not by the focus groups, not by whatever talking heads or the media, but by very, very tough reality and by a very deft move of our mayor, who endorsed President Obama on the eve of the election by saying that climate change needs to play a major role. I don't think we can, any of us, feel too satisfied with where we stand just in the aftermath of this shock, both in our vulnerability, in the losses, and in the continuing political unresponsiveness. It wasn't just a few days after the election that President Obama said again, don't count on any actions quickly. And I was shocked to see his press spokesman say, we will never introduce a carbon tax. Something that a presidential spokesman should never say ever about any policy. But to say it about a policy that actually could protect us and do something in the future is rather shocking. So we're here because we're citizens trying to make sense of a particular disaster, but we're also here because we are trying to make sense of a growing threat to the whole planet. And that's why I'm delighted that this expertise has come together for us. It's a unique opportunity. Listen carefully, ask good questions. And it's now my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to our moderator for today, Bill Glassgall, Managing Editor for Bloomberg. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming today. I'm kind of awed by this audience and by my fellow speakers here on the panel. I'm just a journalist who covers this and who lived in the dark for a week. So I feel your pain, and it's quite an extraordinary couple of weeks we've had. I just wanted to start this discussion off before we turn it to Cynthia and set the stage in about 30 seconds. Number one, a stark fact or two. According to Columbia's own Radley Horton, at least from what we've reported, sea levels have risen a foot since 1900 and will continue to climb. And according to the National Weather Service tide gauge down at the Battery, 7 of the last 13 historical crests recorded since 1950. So that's more than half. 7 of them have occurred in the last 21 years. 2 of them, Sandy at almost 14 feet, and Irene, of course, those have occurred since 2011. Does that suggest we ought to be concerned? Yes, it probably should. All this is coming at a time of more intense storms and more damage. Some of you may have seen the report last month from Munich Re, the big German insurance company. It issued a report saying the rate of extreme weather events is rising, and nowhere is this more evident than in North America. From 1980 through 2011, they said weather disasters caused losses totaling $1.6 trillion worldwide. In North America, weather-related loss events almost quintupled. That's an unthinkable magnitude and something we need to consider. This is not just a concern for academics. This is an academic conference, after all, or insurers. This is a concern for all of us. My colleagues at Bloomberg News reported on a 2009 report from New York City's Office of Emergency Management that predicted a catastrophic storm surge, such as the one we saw with Sandy, that it might put almost 2 million New Yorkers and almost 500 miles of roadways at major risk for flooding. Guess what happened? The inevitable occurred. This scenario could be repeated nationally. 1/3 of all Americans, that's 100 million plus of us, 1/3 of all Americans live in counties immediately bordering the oceans. That's according to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And that means that this is not just a concern for New York or New Orleans or people who live on Long Island Sound. This is really a concern for much of the country. It's a pressing federal concern, and now it's brought home by 2 major urban disasters in just a very few years. And now for the big question we'll be discussing today, which is what's to be done? What's to be done near term, medium term, and for the long haul. And I hope we'll divide our discussion along those temporal lines. Do we change building codes and practices? Do we build tidal surge flood barriers such as those put up or under construction in St. Petersburg, Russia, or Venice, or London? Mindful that the post-Katrina levee system cost U.S. taxpayers $15 billion to protect New Orleans, do we allocate a similar sum, or twice that perhaps, or more, to protect New York, or only partially protect New York? Or do we attack global warming gas emissions and hope for the best for now? And maybe as importantly, how do we change human behavior by homeowners, tenants, subway riders, emergency officials, public health officials, and more? How do we change this behavior so we can better cope with the next disaster, which unfortunately we now pretty much know is going to happen? We don't know the timing, but we certainly know that something is in the offing. So with that, why don't I turn the discussion over to Cynthia to talk about New York and what you've been through, your sleepless days and nights, and what comes next.
Good. Well, the organizers asked me to give an overview of the storm and its aftermath and leading forward. So I'm going to just review the physical aspects of the storm, which were, by all accounts, unusual. I'll give a brief review of the impacts, which were, in many, many parts of the region, devastating. I'll give a brief overview of the links to climate change, because that is a question that has immediately been brought up. And finally, I'm going to give a checklist for topics that we in our group at the in our climate impacts group at Goddard Institute for Space Studies feel is important and needed to go forward. So, launching in. The unusual characteristics of the physical aspects of this storm. It was a one-in-multi-century event. It's hard to know exactly because we don't have a lot of data for 500, 600, 700-year storms. But absolutely, it was a multi-century event. It was unusual because we all know now from looking at watching the TV when we had power that it tracked west into the New Jersey coast. There were very warm waters in the Atlantic Ocean, which were unusual. And perhaps most important in terms of, one of the key pieces of its unusualness was its huge size, that the tropical storm force winds reached 1,000 miles, about 1,000 miles across near the landfall. So it was also the gigantic spatial extent of the storm made it unusual as well. Now we all know, Bill was just sharing some of the wind speeds and issues like that, over 60 miles per hour at all our airports, 90 miles per hour at Islip. The storm surge flooding numbers that Bill was just sharing with us, highest water level at the Battery at 13.88 feet above mean low water. Storm surge was about 9 feet. Coming into the New York Harbor, there was a 32.5-foot wave. Also, for the meteorologists among us, the pressure of storms is very important, and this was the lowest recorded at any location north of Cape Hatteras in approximately 75 years. So those were the unusual aspects of the physical part of the storm. But of course, we care about also so tremendously the impacts. First, we have to take the death toll first. And we have to look not just in New York City, not just in the United States, but a storm is multinational coming up from the Caribbean. So the death toll was approximately 200 people were killed by Hurricane Sandy. About 100 in the United States, about 43 people right in our region. Moving beyond the loss of life to the critical aspects of infrastructure that I know we're going to be discussing with George and others on the panel. On the electricity side, we all know 8 million without power in the United States, 4 million right here. All of our major airports closed. Our 7 subway tunnels under the East River were flooded, 5 miles of path, 2 Long Island railroad tunnels, all flooded. This was extensive coastal flooding. Our road tunnels, not only our train tunnels, but our rail tunnels were closed, but also our car tunnels, Midtown and Brooklyn Battery. And the shipyard also was also flooded, and the yards of the subway cars and our railroad cars were flooded with tracks blocked by boats, etc. Flooding was extensive in all the coastal areas of our 5 boroughs. Staten Island may have been the worst, and actually an interesting thing was in the beginning Staten Island wasn't focused on in the media, but then as people came to realize the tremendous loss of life and devastation there. Long Island, of course, on our New York side, but of course the New York metropolitan region includes New Jersey, our neighbor states, New Jersey and Connecticut. New Jersey, as we all know, tremendous devastation all the way up its entire coastline. On the economic costs, and I'll turn to more economists and Jeff for the estimates. Right now, the estimates are between $30 and $50 billion of damage. That's the combination of both the direct damages and the loss of economic activity nationally as well. And so the slides are showing some of these aspects of the impacts that I was just mentioning. Now, a question that the media asked in all the interviews that we did in our group were, what are the links to climate change? What's the actual link or links? And there are 3 that I want to talk about, and Adam may talk about this later as well. First of all, the most direct link is that sea level rise has already occurred in our region of about 1 foot since 1900. Of that 1 foot, about 1/3 doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It just has to do with what's happening with our land subsidence after the glaciers. But somewhere around 1/3 is due to the expansion of the ocean warming, of the ocean waters, due to the rising temperatures that we've been experiencing globally over the past 100 years. There are also some small terms having to do with melting of land-based glaciers and also perhaps shifts in the Gulf Stream. But the part that is very directly related is particularly that ocean warming with some influence from the melting of land glaciers, from global warming so far. Why is this important? Because when you have higher sea level rise, it's like having a higher basketball court. This is what Radley often uses this analogy, so that when you're going to try to do a slam dunk or have a coastal flooding storm, then your base is higher and it's easier to have that slam dunk of coastal flooding. Now, the two other areas that are linked to climate change or that may be linked to climate change, and we have to be very careful scientifically about the emerging science. One is about the hurricanes and whether, first of all, any particular event cannot be associated with climate change, but whether there is a projection of increasing intensity of the most severe storms. And so this is something that we'll be looking scientifically about to see whether this is indeed, coming to pass as the global climate models and the projections show. Finally, there's a third link to climate change, which has to do with Arctic sea ice and the melting of the sea ice, in which the decreasing sea ice affects the jet stream, making it more wavy, and then perhaps setting up a pattern by which storms could turn west more. I'm going to end the overview so we can get to the discussion with the checklist of what our group feels we need to do to go forward. There are 4 parts of it. First, we need a community vision that includes both communities and leaders. And we need an inclusive process to create this vision of climate resilience, of flexible climate change adaptation pathways to develop, continue and develop our vibrant coastal city region. We need leadership. That's the checklist. Number 1 is community vision. The second part is leadership. We need leadership not only at the city, but at the state and the national levels as well. And we are blessed with leadership right here in New York City with Mayor Bloomberg, who is very much on board and has been working, bringing climate change already. Of course, obviously now we need to do a lot more. The third part on the checklist is a spectrum of solutions. We can easily get into, oh, we should do one thing. We should do the barriers. No, we should do wetlands. No, we should do one thing or another. We have to create a spectrum because of the enormous challenges across engineering solutions, across ecologically based solutions, as well as planning and policies. And throughout all of those, the role of design as we design our coastal city for the future. Finally, last item on the checklist is science. Hurricane Sandy, I believe, is a tipping point for responses to climate change. From this point forward, increasing climate risks need to be taken into account in all that we do to recover and to rebuild from Sandy. And we need this science, and the science, the relationship of the science of the universities and the leaders at all those levels of government and the communities to share, so that the decisions that we make are based on science as we go forward.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
I'd like to hold that idea of leadership for 1 second. And before we get to this, Ben Orloff, you were mentioning to me before we started that you've done some survey work on people's responses and some surprises you found really in the surveying.
Really, people's anticipation of the storm. When we saw the storm was coming, a couple of colleagues of mine, Bob Meyer at Penn and Ken Broad at Miami, set up to conduct telephone interviews every 6 hours as the storm was drawing close from in coastal states, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. And so we were surprised to see how a number of people knew that there was some kind of storm, although there was a lot of confusion of what kind of storm. People were anticipating strong winds. They really underestimated the risk of flooding. We found that many people Less than a third of the people who lived close to the coast had a flood insurance. There were many people who underestimated the risk of the power failure. Most people thought that if the power went out at all, it would go out for a day or two maximum. And we also found that people were very confused about evacuation, that they didn't know if they lived in an evacuation zone, and even if they knew if they lived in one, they didn't know whether there was an evacuation order, and less than an eighth of the people said that they had some kind of evacuation plan. Like, what do you do when you decide to evacuate other than just kind of get in your car and go? So there's really a lack of preparation, and it's also a very uneven lack of preparation, with some areas where people are a little better informed, others where they're less informed, and that does suggest that people, it's not a general ignorance, but that people respond to some kind of programs that prepare them.
Well, in the entire leadership issue, you know, it's great to say our climate is changing, the storm patterns are changing, the water levels are rising. Just in this area, we have 3 state governments. I'm not even going to try and count the number of counties, and I'm certainly not going to try and count the number of municipalities and agencies, all of which have a finger a finger in the water. It's not a finger in the dike. You know, how do you get people to start marching to a successful in a successful campaign?
Can I just jump
Sure,
in?
whoever wants to grab that.
Let me just very briefly to get it going. So what Mayor Bloomberg did starting in 2008 was convene the New York City Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. And on that task force is the managers of all the critical infrastructure in the New York metropolitan region, regardless of who owns it, in terms of MTA, EPA Region 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and including the cell phone providers who were private, as well as the utilities. And by providing that convening leadership, bringing together the people who have to manage that critical infrastructure, then bringing in the New York City panel on climate change to provide the science information, we have an example of the kind of coordinating role that's needed that the leadership can play. They did it for the infrastructure shed of the New York region. So it wasn't divided up into those silos, which can be very high barriers.
Sure, jump in,
action.
please.
So a point about this, and I hate to say this here at Columbia, but the fact of the matter is that science alone rarely brings about the changes that we all desire. This is something that I think is appropriate for Columbia to address at some point, this extraordinary gap between science, including very, very convincing science, we're done with certain conclusions, may or may not have an effect on public policy. And I think the thing is, there's something interestingly similar about poverty in childhood and the issues about climate, in that both of these issues do not have a built-in constituency that has a lot of votes, and they don't have a lot of money. And in the absence of those two factors, really the thing that we're left to depend on is this issue of leadership, as you've just described. But it's a particular kind of leadership. It's more than just gathering people in groups to talk to each other about what the issues are. This has to do with the real hardcore bully pulpit leadership, where the President of the United States says, I am committed to taking this on. This is how we got changes in civil rights, in the war on poverty and so forth. And I think that at some point we'll reach, hopefully, a tipping point that will engage that level of absolute commitment to the issue at the very highest levels. And until we get there, we're kind of still struggling with this.
Well, Adam Sobel, just tell me for a second. You deal with the climate aspect of this. Are our storms getting more intense? Will weather drive better decision making?
About whether the storms are getting more intense, our understanding of the physics tells us that they will, and our best computer models tell us that they will. It's too soon to see it in the observations, not because of anything other than, not because of any scientific problem, other than that the hurricanes vary so much naturally. There's so much natural fluctuation that it takes a long time to see a trend. So, I mean, by the time we can really see it in the observations to everyone's satisfaction, it'll be far too late to do anything about it. And I think we have to be a little bit precautionary in our view of this. I think the way Cynthia ranked the climate change factors is about right. The sea level is very certain and will make events like Sandy more destructive no matter what happens with the storms. And that we're pretty certain of. The only thing we're uncertain of is exactly how fast the sea level will rise. But it's not going down, it's only going up. So that's, yeah.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question, which is we're certainly focused on this tremendous storm and its huge impact. But hurricanes are not the only form of extreme weather event. And
Sure.
I think, I don't know if you could comment on other forms of extreme weather and their links to climate change.
Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to finish the hurricane thing, the models tell us that the storms will get more intense. Maybe more likely the models are saying now fewer rather than more of them, but that's still a new result. And it applies globally. And so in our particular region, whether we'll have more or less is not clear. And since they're all getting more intense, the number of the most destructive ones may actually well go up. I think with respect to Sandy in particular, the most unusual thing was really the track. Had the storm gone out to sea, we wouldn't have thought it was that unusual. Even the merger with a winter storm and all that, that's happened before fairly regularly. It's the left turn that it came, which is totally unprecedented. There is no storm in the historical record that has hit our coastline at that angle.
Well, it made a sharp left turn, and then it made a right turn. We were sort of watching it second by
over
second.
land.
Over land.
Yeah.
It like it couldn't make up its mind.
Yeah, right. Well, by that time it wasn't so destructive anymore. But that left turn, people have related that to sea ice. I think that's the weakest of the links, and that the models actually, there's an observational suggestion in the past history that the sea ice will cause more blocking events, which is what made it make that left turn. The models actually suggest there should be less blocking in the future. So I think we're in a pretty big state of uncertainty about that one now, but it's something that we should study more. As far as other weather events, I think that's a really important question. This event has drawn our attention to climate in a way that nothing else did. And it may not have gotten up to the president yet, but it's gotten up to the mayor and the governor of our state, which is better than we ever did before. So I think that's important, and we're thinking about all these measures seriously, but it's important not to get so caught up in preparing for another event like this that we don't think about the next event, which won't be the same. I mean, we knew all the things could happen here, down to the flooding of the subways and all that. That had been more or less predicted. We knew we could have a storm this big. There have been in the past, although not in the last 150 years, but there have been floods this high in New York City in the recorded history. And the next event will be probably something different. And some events are much more certain. Some we understand much better. The heat waves that Jim Hansen's talked about, the heat wave this summer in Texas, I think was in billions of dollars more expensive than this hurricane, and we've already forgotten about that one. So I think when we think about the climate change connection, it's important to take a broad view and not focus on just the event that just happened.
Yes, George.
I'd like to make a comment in regards to what Cynthia mentioned earlier. This event was really unique. We have some models that tells us what is the 100-year event, what is the 200-year event. This was really a multi-century type of event. However, under the assumption that climate is pretty much the same over the years, because all these concepts of the 100-year or the 500-year event are based on the assumption that climate and the rate of hurricanes is pretty much constant in time. This event was really out of the ordinary by a huge margin, and I'm starting to think whether we have a change, a real change in the weather pattern, and this is not really a 1,000-year event, but because now we have new conditions, this might be the standard of a 100-year event or even a 50-year event. This is something that probably Cynthia could provide more.
Well, can I just ask just a sort of an amplifying question on that? One of our Facebook interested parties or listeners to the WNYC show the other day sent a question in asking, are there similarities between the current change in climate and the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age? So, basically, are there lessons to be, are there climatological and sociological behavioral lessons to be learned from how the Earth changed in these past periods and applied to today?
Let me just quickly respond to George. So, and this is, I think, also what Adam was also bringing forward, that the underlying climate system is changing, and those old, as you're saying, you're bringing out an important point. Our old definitions of 1 in 100, 1 in 500 may not make sense anymore because it's the underlying climate system which is changing. So one of the things that we're working on in our NOAA-funded group is to think about warning systems, and this we'll probably be getting into later also with Erwin, but how can we as scientists to provide better measures or better communication of the risks as they are changing? I think that's one of the major challenges to us.
You know, Cynthia, it's fascinating that the rebuilding of the levees in New Orleans, they're beautiful levees, except they're built to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, based on some sense of the old parameters for how frequently we're going to expect major storms. So if those assumptions are in fact now being questioned, as I totally agree they should be, then we have just made a potentially a horrendously inadequate investment in trying to protect a city that may be subject to much more severe problems much sooner than expected.
I think this depends on the question we're talking about, the time scale, the question that you opened with, and we can see that things are changing now, and they're changing with some rapidity, and I think perhaps there were climate fluctuations in the past, absolutely, as the listener, the person posted on Facebook. I think they're changing faster, and what we're really going to need to do is to develop a new energy policy and to find ways to stop emitting greenhouse gases at an increasing rate. And so this points to the need for that in the long term. And when we start thinking 50 years, 100 years, we realize we're thinking about a phase where we need not only to adapt, but to mitigate, to really change our energy policy. And that's long and slow and difficult, and something we need to work on also, even as we need to protect our cities.
Can I comment on that?
Of course.
One thing that we work not only with New York City, but we work with cities all around the world. And one thing that is striking is that cities are emerging as the first responders to climate change, both on, not only just on adaptation, but on mitigation as well. It seems as if the level of governance, the level of practical organizing citizens is working better at the city level for climate change than the national governments, which have had a very hard time developing a global theory. So that's something that we can talk about, but we certainly are seeing that in many cities around the world, both on mitigation and on adaptation.
Very interesting, and rich and poor countries both.
Yes, both, absolutely.
So we leave FEMA to local governments? Or what's FEMA's role in this? There are people who have said that, including during the campaign.
Do you want to comment?
Certainly there are national, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, just there are some national resources that are important, and it's great to see that the Coast Guard came in, and there are just emergency resources. You need the large size of our country really means that we can bring in resources from distant areas. They had to bring in telephone poles from Virginia. There weren't enough telephone poles for the power lines in New Jersey. But I think there is a capacity of cities for people to recognize the need, and there are many kinds of responses that cities can make. Cities have a lot of local knowledge of what are the particular features of whether it's a transportation system we've been talking about at the power grid. So I think people feel connected to cities, and cities can respond, and cities can learn from each other, not only globally, but locally. You can see different utility companies. If one does particularly poorly, as I have to say the Long Island Power Authority did, they've kind of got mud on their face more because within the region.
Bill brought up kind of a politically hot topic there, and I'll take the bait also. I just want this issue about decentralizing FEMA is a non-starter. It would cost the country at least 10 times as much money to provide the service that FEMA provides if we decentralize it, because that would mean that New York City, Los Angeles, Newark, Miami, et cetera, would each have to have their own fully stocked and ready-to-go systems, which would be very costly. With a nationalized or federalized federal emergency response, then we can divert or deploy assets where we need them, when we need them. And it's just, you know, I'm sure I don't know how you meant the question, but I would not vote for it.
I just wanted to provoke discussion.
Yeah.
Do you think that what would happen is that they wouldn't be duplicated, and some places wouldn't have
That's
the
right.
capability.
Yeah.
George, you had a point.
Yeah, I would like to mention something that is of critical importance on the topic of what to do now. What can we do in order to strengthen our cities so that something like this is not going to happen again? And the issue of return period is something extremely important because all building codes are based on this concept. So if someone considers that Sandy was the 1,000-year event, what we have to do is going to be completely different than if we consider Sandy was the 100-year event or the 200-year event. Because if Sandy was the 1,000-year event, then there is an issue that this happens on the average every 1,000 years. But if it's the 100-year event or the 50-year event or something else, then we have to do something that is much more drastic. So this is an issue that is very, very difficult to be answered from the scientific point of view, but it's going to be critical on the decisions made in the future, immediate future, on mitigation measures for the New York City area, but also for the entire country.
I've made some slides about this issue of return period. If we could show them. It's the second one of the ones that I sent. I don't know if it's possible to do that. The first one will show, this is a plot made by my colleague Tim Hall at NASA GIS. It shows the historical tracks of a bunch of storms that are the most severe that have hit our area in the region, including the 38 storm that hit Long Island, 1903, which is the only other major one to actually make landfall in New Jersey in recent century, Irene and Sandy. What you can see is the extraordinary angle. It's unprecedented. If I show you, if I were to show more storms, you'd see that of all the ones that have come close to New York City and New Jersey at this time, you'd see that there is no other that makes this steep an angle. And that matters for the storm surge because the thing is spinning from where you're sitting, if I can get the spin right, this way. And so coming in at that angle, it means the winds are on shore, pointing toward the shore for New York and New Jersey, which is the worst for a storm surge. And because we were on the right side of the track in northern New Jersey and in New York, the winds are strongest on the right side because that's where the spin of the storm adds constructively to the motion of the storm. So it was unusual in that respect. And although there's other ways of getting such a high surge, this was one of the extraordinary and very unusual ways. So if you can go to the next slide. This is a calculation that's a little harder to explain, but it was done by Tim Hall. What he does is he has a model that can generate statistically gazillions of hurricane tracks with characteristics of the ones that have actually been observed, but by using the statistics in a clever way, drawing information about ones that almost made landfall but didn't, he can generate a much larger than historical sample. And in that way, by doing this for many, many, many millennia, estimate the likelihood of an event that's never occurred. And so the x-axis, if I can get a little scientific for a moment, is the sine of the impact angle. So Sandy was about 0.3, which is that steep impact angle, and the y-axis is the rate. And so according to this measure, Sandy was a 700-year event, meaning that, not the surge per se, but the track, that angle would occur once 700 years, with the confidence limits being 400 to a little over 1,000. So that's not accounting for climate change at all. If you go one more slide, or two more slides, no, one further down, next one. This is a history, this is a paper by, I forgot to put the citation, it's Salepi and Donnelly, who are paleoclimatologists who studied past hurricanes in the geologic record. But this is from the tide gauge of the Battery going back to 1920, and then historical records before that. And you can see where, and it's the storm surge above the mean tide. So Sandy was about 9 feet, you can see it's marked there. And you can see that there haven't been any since there's been a tide gauge, which is since 1920, but that in the 1800s and late 1700s, there were 3 events about that high. So this, in terms of, so what this says, just to give the numbers as best as I think we can do it today, assuming no climate change, that track is a 1 in 700-year event with a big error bar on it, but something like that. And that makes sense because in 150 years, we've never seen one. But yet the surge is not that rare, in the sense that in the last few hundred years, there have been a few events like that. And so that's in our present climate. Now, what the storms will do in the future and how much these statistics will be changing, we don't know. But because of the sea level, we have to keep coming back to that. Because of the sea level, what was a 1 in 300 year surge is now going to be a much more frequent surge, even with no change in that.
Well,
So those are numbers as far as...
What I'd like to do is come back to this discussion later. We do want to stay on our schedule, and I want to go to Erwin to talk about response.
All right, I'm happy to do that. And I think there's a few comments I just want to make about this. I'm going to keep this brief because I think the discussion is great. But nobody breathing in America was not aware of the impact of this storm on our region. This tremendous breadth of 1,000 miles took a toll that was very severe. But interestingly, from a fatality point of view, far less than Katrina. And there's some reasons that are important about that, but I'll come back to that. This slide just shows a few examples of the many images that we were looking at as the storm is hitting and in its immediate aftermath. I want to point to the picture on the lower left. It's the evacuation, one of the evacuation shots of patients being removed under very, very perilous conditions from NYU Langone Medical Center, and without really any serious mishap, transferred to other institutions literally in the middle of the storm. You can't see this, but at the very lower piece, there's a couple little lab rats there. I just want to mention them because it represented a tremendous loss of extraordinarily important research lines that happened as just part of the general impact of a storm like this on really setting back research, biomedical research in some particular areas. The thing that I want to point out, though, if we can go to the next slide, is that the purple basically represents structures that were damaged in the storm, and then the other icons are various types of recovery centers, feeding centers, warming centers, and so forth. And the issue about the recovery, and this is really early, this is like giving, even before the first semester is up, a very preliminary assessment or grading. It is extremely mixed reports so far. So the initial impressions are, yes, we did well in these sort of sub-crises like evacuating a hospital. We had heroism that was unbelievable, and really people, from National Guards people to hospital workers, did an amazing job in taking people safely out under very difficult conditions. But many, many other issues we still have concerns about. Those concerns range from literally what was, there's no other way to describe this other than a failed evacuation of Zone A. We just didn't do it. We didn't do it in Irene, and we didn't do it even to a greater extent with Sandy. The failures of evacuation, one of the things that's interesting to me is that we learn nothing from the problems with evacuation. Crisis messaging, what do people need to hear? What are the reasons that people do or don't leave a danger zone? All of that was like just whatever. We just did the same thing over and over again, and we did the same thing, same messages, the same messengers, the same agenda in this year's superstorm. That's a problem because it reminds me of this notion that I've been talking about for some time. We keep thinking of these big events as wake-up calls. Now, this is the one that'll really get us over the line, and we'll be dealing now with climate change, fixing the infrastructure, and so forth. We think of them as these wake-up calls, but really, what I've said is that they're more like snooze alarms, and I'm hoping that won't be the case here. We get very excited. We're having symposia like this. There's a lot of media coverage, and at some point, we're going to be hit by another blast of complacency. And this is really what I'm concerned about, how to keep up the momentum that we currently have for at least a few minutes now to try to make sure that we really reach towards real solutions. And it's also interesting that not a single event or mishap that happened during Sandy's response and recovery so far, all of it was forewarned by what happened in Katrina in 2005. Every single problem that you may have seen or may see as the weeks and months roll on was forewarned by our experiences back then. And that's something that we really have to understand, that the dynamic of absorbing lessons and acting on them is something we haven't absorbed yet. So I want to leave really with 3 points. We can go to the next slide, please. So we basically exist on a spectrum at any moment in time between vulnerability and resiliency. And except for a few massive events I could probably think about, but no reason sharing them here, we're never going to be totally vulnerable. There are very few species wiping out disasters that you can conceive of or should conceive of. And this is so this is all relative. But relatively speaking, we're not in a good place on this spectrum. We're far more given our state of knowledge, our engineering, our resources, we should be much farther towards the resilient end of this than we currently are. And I'm going to come back to what that's about in just a minute. But the issue about vulnerability is a complex one. And what I'm talking about as a public health and health person is really vulnerability with respect to the human condition and our well-being and our safety. And to me, one of the big litmus tests is how do we do with the most vulnerable people in our society? So we're going to talk about infrastructure, and we certainly should. But I also want to just say a word about frail elderly people living on high floors in housing projects, about children, about people with chronic medical conditions whose medical supplies were cut off during this event and will be in future events unless we do something about it. And so far, we haven't really done well, even with all these other events in our recent past. Second point, I just want to, if we can go to the next slide, please, is this issue of recovery. And here's where the real tests of our capabilities come in terms of disaster response. Response is relatively easy. We've gotten pretty good at that. We got a lot of, I mean, relatively speaking, we have a lot of very capable first responders. We've seen them in action. We love watching their pictures on television doing their thing and rescuing people. Where the test of our values and our vision comes is in how well and how rapidly we return societies and communities to a state of normalcy. And we have three options, really, in terms of recovery. We can either plain rebuild, and that would mean for the lower Ninth in New Orleans or areas of Far Rockaway, building back, basically bad housing, slums, and disadvantaged communities. What we like to say is we'd like to rebuild better. That means that we're going to take this opportunity, unfortunately, from the big disaster to try to create communities that are more livable, more viable, and more supportive of the human condition. There's a third option, though, that we don't really talk about enough, which is rebuilding elsewhere. Because we can look at a place like New Orleans and we see the subsidence of the city, the rising sea levels, and the coastal erosion from a variety of factors. And we could legitimately ask ourselves a question: why do we spend billions of dollars putting up levees that won't be big enough and rebuilding houses that'll still be in danger? And if we can't get serious about the grown-up issues of dealing with really fixing infrastructure and really dealing with climate change, we're doomed, we're destined to have these recurrent issues constantly. If we can go to the next slide, please. We're here at Columbia, obviously a global institution at the highest possible level of academics and research capacity. And I have long been thinking that there is much more that could be done in an interdisciplinary, cross-sector way to improve the way we approach things like disasters and resiliency and vulnerability in society. And I think the opportunity now is right before us. Mega disasters, in a sense, force cross-sectoral integration of these complex systems, whether it's the fuel supply or dealing with climate change or making our coastlines more resilient or the public health issues. All of them seem to come together in this terrible laboratory in the aftermath of a great disaster. It's something that we really need to pay attention to. And the final point, there's no slide for this, it's like a bonus point, which has to do with societal investments. And this is something I think we ought to think long and hard about. And we will invest in probably improving some of the bad situations. I don't know how many of you are familiarly attached to the Red Cross, but there's a lot of problems to deal with there. Intergovernmental relationships and functioning needs to be worked on. But at the end of the day, we are really going to have to address, with big dollars, big commitment, and big bully pulpits, two big issues. Infrastructure investment, which when I wrote about this in 2006, the American Society of Civil Engineers said it will cost about $1.7 trillion to upgrade and fix the U.S.'s infrastructure. Now it's about $2.2 trillion. And I've said from the beginning, this is what a great investment. It creates jobs on every level in society. It is a real stimulus to the economy. And it would have been incredible if we were already now 7 years down the road from Katrina, investing in fixing America's infrastructure. And the second thing, which of course is all of us have been talking about, and Cynthia emphasized very poignantly, is this issue of climate change. We must get control of that and deal with it like we need to in order to make ourselves move farther along towards the resilient end of that spectrum I showed you earlier.
Well, thanks. Just rewind the tape for a minute. You talked about the failed evacuation, or the second failed evacuation. Tell me about that. What could we have done better? How can you force people? How can you force people in a densely populated urban area to get the heck out?
Well, first of all, I want to ask the question whether they should have gotten the heck out. And as I wandered up and down the lines where people were getting meals and other services in Far Rockaway and Staten Island and a shelter we visited in New Jersey, and I said, you were in a danger zone, especially for New York City residents, in the very circumscribed Zone A. And the mayor had people on megaphones saying, get out. So here's what I heard. Mothers saying, I have 2 children with asthma. I don't really feel like going into a congregate shelter with I don't know if you've ever been inside these shelters. They're small cots, folding cots lined up one next to each other. So you and your 2 young children might be next to somebody with all sorts of issues and problems that you don't want to expose your children to. You don't know when you're going to get back. There's people that told me, I was in the military, I can handle this. A lot of people told me that their clergy people told them that prayer would be the answer. And they believe that. So if we want to do a message that really affects people in communities, maybe it's the messenger should be left much more local than centrally in the mayor's office. But the other thing is people said we were afraid of leaving our possessions. Looting was a major problem. And so we have to get more into this. This is not the lower ninth, these projects, where the houses actually disappeared. And being in the house was an absolute danger. These were projects that were made of brick and actually, other than the flooding, could withstand a significant amount of damage, and the shelter system wasn't so great. So I'm just saying that here we need research. We need focus groups. We need surveys to figure out why people do or don't leave, ask if they should actually leave, and then operate from that point.
Yeah. Just evacuation, I think, is something that requires coordination on a lot of levels. That point of the shelters shows that if there were better shelters, there might be more people who would evacuate. And I think there's quite a bit of kind of informal evacuation in New York. My mother-in-law stayed with us for 4 nights, and she's a sweet lady. Still beats me at Chin Rummy. I don't know how she does it. And my building had a lot of other people for whom it wasn't quite a matter of life and death, but they were without heat, they were without refrigeration, so there really was urgent for them to get someplace. There was a whole listserv that involved shipping people were sharing air mattresses. Those who had extra air mattresses and those who had extra guests could work that out. And so I think you would hope to have both strong neighborhoods where there'd be more of this, and there would also be a system for the people who are structurally disadvantaged, as you're pointing out. And that is, again, one of these intermediate scales. And so for these short-term perceptions of, there are many reasons people would give for not evacuating, but I think that's something that you need to reflect not just on the level of individual psychology, but really on the level of a kind of more collective culture, that there are places where people evacuate better than the Netherlands. The Netherlands evacuates well, and it's not just because they're more homogenous, but because...
Yeah, please.
A colleague, Salim Huq, who is from Bangladesh, a climate change impact specialist, actually has offered to come to New York, and we're going to actually be hosting a meeting through the Urban Climate Change Research Network on what lessons we can learn from Bangladesh on this, because they have a lot of social networking around evacuation with people on lower ground. They know at the higher ground who they're going to go with, not necessarily some families, but some beyond. So I think we do have to look beyond just New York, echoing some of what you both are saying. I think also just within the region, we held a workshop just a few months ago in Stevens in Hoboken. And the mayor of Hoboken, who is a wonderful woman, had said that she looks to New York for guidance on evacuation and the actual evacuation decision. So one of the things I think when we are doing the research that Erwin is suggesting that we do, I think we do need to do it region-wide and think about how the linkages because I remember her distinctly saying when Mayor Bloomberg for Irene made the decision to evacuate, and they did evacuation in Hoboken, and Hoboken was completely flooded. So some of the decisions may be broader than, some of the impacts may be broader than just within our 5 boroughs.
Hoboken's a good example because I remember a previous flood in Hoboken that was remarkably similar to this one. The water poured into the path system. The New Jersey Transit rail yard and station were flooded, not as bad, but were flooded and knocked out nonetheless. So they have, and part of the Hoboken waterfront has been sort of crumbling into the Hudson for a while now. So they have actual experience, but we're kind of not greatly able to deal with this. George and I were talking in the green room before about this. We talk about evacuations, but the other big question is, well, what the heck do we do? Do we build a tidal barrier in the Verrazzano Narrows? Which is kind of what some other cities have done? Do we build berms? Do we put big inflatable airbags in front of the path and the subway entrances and the tunnel entrances? Physically, is there something to be done? Along with organizing people better.
Definitely, there's no doubt about it.
And by the way, what's the price tag? Because we're all broke anyway.
Yes. First of all, there is not a single unique solution that is going to provide the escape from this problem. It's always a combination of different solutions, and there are short-term solutions, medium-term, and long-term. And we have to consider a combination of these. As far as short-term solutions, there are a lot of things that can be done, and essentially the majority of the flooding of the subway system could have been avoided. It's not an issue that the entire system was flooded. There was a relatively small number of stations and ventilation grates that allowed water to get into the system. These are well known. By the way, the slide that you see there with the blue lines, it indicates flooding of the system. This was not done after the hurricane. This was part of a report that has been published 1.5 years ago. Actually, this was part of the climate study that Cynthia led, and this was the transportation component. And we have predicted that all these subway tunnels would be flooded. And we have indicated which stations have to be essentially sealed and specifically which ventilation grates. And it was a relatively small number. Floodgates cost some amount of money, there is no doubt about it, but it's a reasonably small amount of money. And it is definitely possible to build this in a relatively short period of time. This kind of a solution in combination with building levees and dikes and sand berms can provide a short-term solution to the problem. Now, the medium-term solutions involve either raising the infrastructure. Let's say you have a highway that floods all the time. You consider raising this part of the infrastructure, and this way you prevent flooding, but also you create probably some kind of a levee to prevent water coming in. At the same medium range of solutions, we have the often discussed barriers. And the barriers consist of 3 major structures, one at the location of the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, another one between Staten Island and New Jersey, and another one on Long Island Sound. In my personal opinion, this would cost a minimum of $20 billion, probably more than that. And they will provide definitely protection for a significant part of the population in the area. However, the communities that were mostly devastated with Sandy, Staten Island, the Rockaways, New Jersey Shore, Long Island, will not be protected by these barriers. These barriers will protect mostly the inside of New York City Harbor, Manhattan, and parts of Queens and Brooklyn, behind the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. So there's an important question here. Are we willing to spend $20, $30 billion, and this most probably will be federal funds, to protect only a relatively small percentage of the population in the major metropolitan area? And eventually, the third level of protection, the very long-term solutions, is horizontal movement, meaning that we should start thinking now about moving some communities that are repeatedly devastated during events like this to a different location. Of course, this is a very controversial issue, but I am classifying it as long-term. We have to start considering a solution like this. And all solutions, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, have to be considered on a cost-benefit point of view. I mean, you spend an amount of money to do something so that you minimize losses into the future. But does this make sense? There is always the base with which everything has to be compared, doing nothing. You do nothing and you pay the consequences, and then you have to compare this with the cost of doing something. In most cases, in my personal opinion, it makes sense to do something beforehand. And this is the right time. Memory fades very, very fast, and the next 6 months to 1 year are going to be critical about making some decisions. And I would like also to mention something else. Another major problem during Sandy was the loss of power. And we see that in the suburbs outside of New York City, but also in some parts of New York City, power lines are overground. During hurricanes and nor'easters, essentially when you have a strong wind, there's going to be always a tree or a branch of a tree that will fall on some of these power lines, and you're going to have loss of power. Gradually, we have to start putting all these power lines and communication lines, telephone lines and so on, underground. This is going to be a major advantage for all these communities that will not have to lose power repeatedly. And it should be one of the major priorities, in my opinion. It's a major investment. It's going to cost significant amounts of money, but it will have to be done in a gradual way over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Because it's totally unacceptable having communities close to a major metropolitan area like New York City that lose power repeatedly every year. I have colleagues of mine who live in New Jersey, and they're telling me that it's very common in a typical year to lose power 2, 3, 4 times per year. Not, of course, of the duration that happened after Sandy, but sometimes 2, 3, 4 days. This is something that has to be addressed in the long term.
Well, I want to. That's a terrific point. Having sat in New Jersey in the cold and in the dark for a week, I appreciate it, and it's not the first time. I want to open up the floor to questions. We have 2 microphones in the two central aisles here. When you get up there, please just tell us who you are and ask the question. Do we have some questions? No questions at all. We do right here. But please go over to the mic. Okay. Why don't we take the first question over here, and then we'll take a question for you on my right. Yes, ma'am. Tell us who you are.
My name is Hannah Milnes, and I'm a freshman in Columbia College. First, I'd like to thank the panel, Professor Sachs, Mr. Glasgow, and Mr. Pudi for their presence. In light of the recent World Bank report predicting the global temperature increase of 4 degrees Celsius in this century, could the panel speak to the economic responsibilities of major institutions like Columbia University to combat environmentally destructive practices by divesting from major fossil fuel corporations?
So I think it's very important to get changes in energy policy, and I think it's very important to make changes in energy policy, and certainly the energy producers, the companies, are a key element. And I think divestiture sometimes is a wonderful strategy, and I think it's certainly shown off in South Africa. It just seems to me that we're not gonna, we can't just sort of step back and imagine that our hands are clean, because we're so connected to energy, we're buying energy, we can't step away from them, actually. I think it's, as I think about it, I want to find ways to put pressure on them. And at first I liked the idea of divesting, and I thought, where are the lights gonna be? We're committed as an entire society to an energy path.
Thanks very much. Question over here, please.
Hello. My name is Crystal Lehman with UN Earth News. So my question is actually in regards to using natural resources in helping with infrastructure. A few months ago, or a month ago, the New York Times reported on possible marshlands in order to keep from flooding. And there are a lot of other ideas floating around. Can you guys speak to that?
Yes, sure. I'll speak to that.
Sure.
As I said in my overview, we've covered, George just gave a very great overview about solutions on the engineering side, but we also, as part of that spectrum of solutions, need to take ecologically based adaptation and natural resources into account. And there's several things, and one of the main ones, of course, is marshlands, which New York City has already started, for example, with the Blue Belt program in Staten Island. But the research that needs to be done is on the scale, the scaling up. Evidently in New Orleans, they said that you needed 1 mile of wetlands to reduce a storm surge flooding of 1 foot. Here in the New York metropolitan region, we have such a fragmented urban ecology. So, but we've already begun to restore wetlands, and we need to do tests and to do more to see how those wetlands can fit in as natural buffers to the storms.
Yeah, one of the great tragedies in this region is how over centuries we've filled in the New Jersey meadowlands, which are our natural defense. So, and we've discovered that asphalt is a lousy defense against a storm.
And Jamaica Bay.
And Jamaica Bay too.
I'd just like to point out the people who restore the New York City wetlands are here in the Parks Department.
Great, good.
I would like also to mention that there has been a natural defense in the entire area, sand dunes. But gradually, we have decided to start building on the sand dunes and having all these houses next to the seafront. In the past, these sand dunes were essentially acting as barriers that were essentially diminishing the effect of these storm surges. But if society decides to build essentially in front of the water, you realize that it's a problem that is extremely difficult to address.
We have a question at this mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tillinger, and I must say 2 of my professors are up there. I graduated from Lamont, and I'm currently a visiting professor of physics at Marymount Manhattan College. And I was really interested that you guys talked about community responses and leadership and what really gets people to do things. And amazingly, nobody mentioned the Occupy movement. I don't know about where everyone else has been. I've been volunteering on the Lower East Side. I've been coordinating getting medical supplies and food to people who live on high floors of our public housing buildings. Particularly, there's a housing unit there for the deaf, which brings with it a whole different set of problems. And the people that I've seen actually doing the aid work have almost all been members of Occupy. So I was wondering if you could speak to that model of dealing with disaster, both in terms of response and that longer-term recovery.
Well, let me take a shot at that. I think it's you make a very legitimate point, and but it's not just Occupy. There's been lots and lots of voluntary organizations and individuals who have been making multiple treks up and down buildings in the projects and so forth. The problem for me, because I deal with this constantly, is that we end up in these disaster scenarios having these sort of random acts of response and random acts of preparedness. It is disorganized. It is, I don't know, if we had another disaster next week, is Occupy going to be there? Is the Red Cross going to be there? Is my next door neighbor who was collecting blankets and coats going to feel like doing it next week? It's what happens is that the good intentions of people, which really need to be encouraged and celebrated, actually has to be accompanied by very significant taking responsibility. I don't even know how many people there were, and nobody knows, who were frail elderly in these projects. So if Occupy went to 3 buildings, but there's 56 buildings, who's doing the rest? And this is such as from my perspective that we need to get much more responsible about somebody overviewing this. It's really complicated. You know, people talked about the great work that Habitat for Humanity did in the Gulf region after Katrina, and they certainly did. They built about 11,000 houses for people over a couple-year period. But 250,000 houses or apartment buildings were destroyed by the storm. So there's a disconnect between voluntary efforts and scale. This sort of scaling up issue, which Cynthia mentioned, is something we have to get a grip on. It's not like you know, putting up sandbags and preventing a river in Iowa from you know, or ruining a neighborhood. We're talking about when we get to the level of these massive disasters, it takes more than the voluntary organization, although without them, we'd even be in much worse shape than we already are. I don't know that directly answers you, but I appreciate the efforts, but I'm looking to the systems to make sure that we know what we're doing and how much we need to do.
We have a question over here at the mic. Yes, sir.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sean Captain with TechNewsDaily.com. So right afterwards, I found Facebook pages, for example, that said meet in the Rockaway and, help clear out a house. And, cell phones have been really helpful just to find out where someone is and how to get to them. Going beyond just the standard line, Facebook and Twitter, can cause revolutions. What are the kinds of things, and I've seen efforts to build databases of resources, other ways to connect people. What do you see as sort of the tech priorities to allow, whether it's the federal authorities or it's Occupy volunteers, but anyone to sort of respond better and to make these more resilient in the case that there is a disaster?
That's a terrific question, because and George spoke to it before. It's not just electric power. The electric power went down. The cell phone service became spotty at best in many areas. Those of us who had no power had no other communications. The landline phones are being replaced by phones that are driven by fiber optics and the cable system. So everything is kind of connected to electric power. Governor Cuomo has talked about hardening the electric power grid in this area, perhaps starting with Long Island Lighting, or Long Island Power Authority, the former Long Island Lighting Company. Talk about the city goals, the general goals, and the societal goals in hardening the infrastructure. Whoever wants to pick it up.
I think George made such good points about the need for multiple solutions. And I think there's also a sense that we need solutions, and that among us, you just get some professors together and we'll whip out a list of solutions, and then you just go and implement them. And it's really a long process of learning. And there'll be different solutions at different scales. And perhaps that sounds kind of vague, and you would really much prefer us to say something about here's precisely how you redo the grid. But you really need to get all the different parties together to work with a will.
I'd just like to point this out. George mentioned that we just, with actually colleagues all over the state, last year published it was called the Climate Assessment, which was an adaptation assessment across multiple sectors, because one of the things is that we have to do the interdependencies, as you were just saying, that when you, it's not just looking at each sector individually, but as the power goes out, then eventually people's cell phones can't be charged. The water system is related. They all are interdependent. But in this, with both researchers and experts from all over the state, in our major sectors, and we included an equity piece in it for the first time. it's filled with ideas for solutions. So, for example, like some very specific ones, like on the backup generators at the cell towers, that they have to have more fuel. Right now, you see, it's just like every single thing we have to think, how do we respond to this? How do we keep everything going better? I totally agree with George, as I said too. It has to be an integrated set of solutions across all these different sectors and pieces, including not just engineering, but also ecology and policies and planning as well.
If I want to find that report responding to climate change responding
yep.
to climate change in New York State, is there
yes.
without going into a 200-character
no,
URL?
It's
where do I
at
find
NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA.org, and it's look up climate, you'll find it.
NYSERDA.org. Remember that address for this great report.
Climate.
We have a question over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Matt Richter, and I'm a photojournalist with UN Earth News. And for the past 2 weeks, I've been documenting the situation and also volunteering of the crisis in the public housing projects in Coney Island. And it's quite terrifying, the situation that's still going on right now. Driving between Brooklyn or from Manhattan to Coney Island, it feels like I'm traveling to a third world country where people have only within the past few days gotten heat and hot water back. And these are the most vulnerable communities in New York City that have quite literally been pushed to the edge of the city. And in many of these, and while like the external damage to these buildings is not nearly as apparent as the other hard-hit areas, the crisis going on inside is quite appalling, in that there are elderly and sick people that have been trapped on the 20th floor and haven't left their apartment in 3 weeks and have been living without anyone to check on them. I personally met an 87-year-old woman who had run out of medication, and the only person who checked on them was a volunteer that came through one of the grassroots organizations that has been doing incredible work down there. But I'm just realizing it's a much broader picture about how you protect these vulnerable communities. It's not about just building a seawall. I'm just wondering, like, what changes need to be made to the infrastructure, to urban planning, to social services.
You know, vulnerable population issues like you're describing are absolutely heartbreaking, and to the extent that we're failing those vulnerable populations really is a sorry reflection on our value systems and our competence in dealing with big, large-scale events like this. And I think at the end of the day, this is not just a question of systems issues. It's a question of how people function, what is the expectation of government, what should the New York City Office of Emergency Management actually be planning for, and unfortunately, these populations you're talking about, there's many more of them, people in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and so forth, have not been served well here in this event or in past events. And that is something that requires greater investment in providing agencies with the ability to understand what the issues are and how to solve them, and people to go and check. We don't even have a database about how many seniors there are out there that need help. Visiting nurse service in New York sees about 33,000 people at any given time in their schedules. That is a small fraction. We don't even know what the denominator is, but a small fraction of everybody that needs the kind of assistance that you got to witness firsthand. It's horrifying, along with a number of other things. I'm a sort of a half-empty glass kind of guy, so don't get me started here. And we're at the end of our time. But the point is, we have a lot of work to do on this, and I'm really glad to hear that you're helping to bring some visibility to some of those problems that are just terrible.
Well, actually, we are at the end of our time. I'm sorry I can't get to the remaining 8 or 9 people who are standing in line. Perhaps you can grab the panelists later. This is a great way to wrap up, really, because we've talked about climate change, we've talked about infrastructure change, we've talked about societal change. Obviously, we've been awakened to the need for change and investment in change.
I want to thank you panelists so much for coming and for sitting here under very hot lights for an hour and a half. Thank you, audience. Thank you everybody out on the web who's been watching us. And let's do this again.